So the developmental arrest hypothesis was something that was put forward to explain what may be going on with the development of language in Williams syndrome individuals, right? So one of the main things that we know is their language skills seem really impressive in comparison to their other cognitive abilities, but they still lag behind the language skills of typically developing children of the same chronological age. And so the developmental arrest hypothesis basically says there's a ceasing, an arrest of development, and there's no further growth beyond this point. So the arrest hypothesis suggests that structures typically acquired late in development may never be acquired by people with Williams syndrome, WS, or indeed might be acquired in a way that fits late learning by normal individuals, right? So their language learning ability, in some sense, their native language learning ability is arrested at a particular point. And so let's look a little bit more closely at that. So some supporting evidence for this is that Williams syndrome individuals never seem to master late developing linguistic knowledge, such as raising. So raising is when we have an implied or silent subject. So she seems to like penguins. We talk about this liking event. Two isn't a subject, doesn't tell you who's liking, but we somehow interpret it as if she is the one who's doing the liking in this liking penguins event. She seems to like penguins. She's the one doing the liking in this event that's being described. And so this relationship where she seems to be interpreted here, but we hear it here, is that it's called raising. It's raised up to this position, this earlier position. And so Williams syndrome individuals don't seem to ever really master that, and children, typically developing children, seem to master that late. Williams syndrome individuals struggle with certain types of passives that typically developing children don't master till after age 5. And other types of morphosyntactic knowledge, morphology and syntactic knowledge, together that's acquired late by typically developing children doesn't seem to be acquired at all by Williams syndrome individuals. So that is in line with developmental arrest, because the arrest of their development would have occurred before they would have learned these different structures. And in fact, there's evidence both from language functions and from spatial learning as well, because as we saw in earlier slides here, the Williams syndrome children have real trouble with certain types of spatial information. Right? And so the idea is that if you have sort of the age in years of a typically developing child, right, 0 through 9, and then in Williams syndrome you have a sort of a delayed or slowed down version of that, where maybe this is what they're at age 8, and this is age 12, and this is age 16. And this is sort of, you can think about this as amount of language knowledge, where 100% is adult-like proficiency in whatever, whether it's language knowledge in the case of the red, or blue, where we have, so this is both of these together, my apologies. So this is both language and spatial knowledge together, this is language and spatial knowledge together, but there's, because of the difficulty of the relevant language or spatial knowledge, some of it may be early emerging, where you sort of reach near that 100% point much earlier, like between 4 and 5 for a typically developing kid, versus things that are late emerging, either because it's more spatially difficult or it's more linguistically difficult. It takes you much longer if you're a typically developing kid, maybe 8 or 9, before you reach that higher, more mature level of knowledge. And if arrest is occurring at about this point in typically developing kids, and it's occurring therefore at about maybe between 10 and 12, right, for our Williams syndrome kids, then that is a really good match for what we see in their spatial and language functions. So people with Williams syndrome sort of have a retarded or slowed development in comparison, right, to regular, typically developing kids. And then it stops, right? So you sort of get to this point and you stop. So whatever regular, typically developing kids would have at this age is what your Williams syndrome sort of ends with, period. Like, even if they continue aging and maturing, their knowledge, both spatially, both the early maturing stuff and the late maturing stuff, never goes beyond this point. So if it's the early maturing stuff, that's actually pretty good. You're like maybe 80 or 90% good at that. But if it's the late maturing stuff, you're really lagging behind. And so the result is that you have a cognitive profile for both spatial and language functions that resembles that of a typically developing 4 to 6 year old, right? Somewhere around in this area is where the arrest happens cognitively. And again, because your Williams syndrome have a sort of slower timeline, their arrest may for them age-wise kind of occur at 10 or 12, right? Around this point. But they will never progress past this level of knowledge. The development has been arrested at this point in knowledge. And that is the developmental arrest hypothesis, which at the moment seems to be a pretty good way to explain the kinds of cognitive development, the cognitive things that Williams syndrome folks can do and the ones that they can't do.